presentations featuring Dr. Kathy Lee Miller, Christina Nielsen, Julie Nichols, and then at the end we will have time for Q&A. So you can save your questions until then, or you can pop them in the chat box as we go, and we will get to them then as well. So whatever you prefer. And then at the end, I will just share a few exciting program updates. So before I dive into our presenters today, we just wanted to give a quick little highlight of who we are. We're happy to have so many existing members, but we also know there are many new people joining us today. So for those who may not be familiar with who we are the Wisconsin Cancer Collaborative, and we are a statewide coalition of many different organizations and members working together to reduce the burden of cancer for everyone in Wisconsin. Membership is free. If you're not a member, we would love to have you join. You get put on our email list, so you will receive our monthly newsletter, and then you'll also get updates for when we do different events like this, as well as when we have some new resources coming out. Our work is guided by the Wisconsin Cancer Plan, and this is kind of what serves as our blueprint for action in Wisconsin. It spans the entire cancer control continuum from risk reduction through end of life, with data and equity woven into that. And so the success of the plan really depends on all of the people and organizations from many different sectors coming together to take action. So you can explore this plan in depth on our website. It's featured right on there. So if you go to wicancer.org, you can find that pretty easily. And then before I introduce our first speaker, here is what the current landscape of pediatric cancer care in Wisconsin looks like. There are 5 locations across the across the state where pediatric cancers are treated. In Madison at American Family Children's Hospital, in Milwaukee at Children's Wisconsin, Gunderson Health System in La Crosse, St. Vincent's in Green Bay, and then Marshfield Clinic in Marshfield. So with that, I am pleased to introduce our first speaker, who is going to provide us with data on childhood cancers in Wisconsin. Lena Swander has been an epidemiologist with the Division of Public Health since 2017. She currently supports cancer surveillance with the Wisconsin Cancer Reporting System and is passionate about responsible, equity-focused public health data visualization and interpretation. Lena also coordinates the Wisconsin Cancer Reporting System's data request and research portfolio of over 50 active projects. She received her Master's of Public Health in Epidemiology from the University of Iowa and her Bachelor of Science in Biology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Lena, feel free to take it away.
Sure. Thanks everyone for being here today. This is our outline. We've got just a couple of minutes this morning, so we're going to breeze through quite a bit of data, but I'll pass along our contact information for the Wisconsin Cancer Reporting System at the end. So if you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out to us. So this presentation is going to summarize cancer incidence and mortality in Wisconsin with a slight focus on leukemias, brain and other CNS tumors, and lymphomas. And for all these cancer site groupings, we're using the International Classification of Childhood Cancer, or ICCC. So just some things to keep in mind. So the Wisconsin Cancer Reporting System, where a lot of the data is coming from, we were established in 1976 to collect cancer incidence on Wisconsin residents, and we've got high quality incidence data currently available for diagnosis years 1995 through 2020. Cancer incidence data are dynamic, meaning we're getting abstracts and reports all the time and updating the quality of our data. And we use this data in public health surveillance and to support cancer prevention and control research. So childhood cancers, as many of you know, are a collection of many diseases found in different places in the body. And for this presentation, all newly diagnosed malignant invasive neoplasms occurring under children ages under 20. That's how we're defining childhood cancers. But later today, you'll probably see things like AYA cancers, but yeah, for this, it's all under 20 combined. The most common types of childhood cancer for those under 20 are leukemias, brain and other central nervous system tumors, and lymphomas. So although childhood cancer is considered rare, it's a leading cause of death past infancy. So about 24% of Wisconsin's population is under the age of 20. And in 2020, 36 children, Wisconsin children died of cancer, making it the fourth leading cause of death in Wisconsin for those ages 1 to 19. So it looks like we just looked at some of this information. If you want to keep advancing, Alex. Yep, thank you. So outlook for children and adolescents with cancer have improved in the last 5 decades. So back in the 1970s, about 58% of children and 68% of adolescents were diagnosed with cancer survived at least 5 years. The most recent 5-year survival rates are now estimated at about 85% for both groups. So we're going to look at some childhood cancer incidence rates next. And for those maybe who haven't seen rates like these before, all of them are going to be expressed within 1 million individuals at risk for a given cancer. So typically adult cancers are reported at 100,000, and this is pretty standard. So just in case you're looking at that axis and thinking, why is it 1 million? This is because childhood cancers are rare. And so we use a larger denominator for ease in interpreting. And all of these rates are also age adjusted. So Wisconsin childhood cancer incidence rates from this graph here in the blue have increased since 2000 from about 169 to about 177 per 1 million in 2020 now. So, and these rates mirror national trends made available by 22 other cancer registries across the US. Next slide. Males are more likely to be diagnosed with childhood cancer before the age of 15, but the female rate is nearly equal between ages 15 and 19, as shown on the graph on the left. And between 2016 and 2020, 746 Wisconsin males were diagnosed with cancer compared to 633 females. Next slide. So from about 2016 to 2020, leukemias, brain and other central nervous system, and lymphomas were the most commonly diagnosed cancer sites for Wisconsin children. Leukemias account for about 1/4 of all childhood cancers during this time, with 355 cases out of the 1,379 total cases diagnosed and reported to us during that time. Next slide. So childhood cancer incidence trends by site in Wisconsin mirror US rates for those top 3 cancers. So for leukemias, we're seeing that same trend along with lymphomas and brain and other CNS tumors. Rates have fluctuated over time, but when we compare 2000 and 2002 combined rates with the 2018 to 2020, we're not seeing statistically different rates from those in the US that are shown in the orange dotted line. Next slide. From 2016 to 2020 in Wisconsin, non-Hispanic American Indian and Alaskan Native children had the lowest incidence rate, or excuse me, the highest incidence rates, and non-Hispanic Asian or Pacific Islander had the lowest. These differences were not statistically significant between groups. And so I just have a little data caveat here, just wanting to urge people to interpret these sort of observed disparities with caution because the counts are very low for some categories, meaning our confidence intervals around these estimates are very, very wide. Next slide, please. We also took a look at comparing urban versus rural counties for childhood cancers. From 2016 to 2020, rural counties had higher childhood cancer rates than urban counties, but again, like with the race and ethnicity breakdowns, these differences were not statistically significant during this time period. We've got a little figure on the right-hand side to show you that breakdown between the blue rural counties and the orange urban counties. Next slide. We'll do a quick overview of some cancer mortality rates as well in children under the age of 20. And again, just like with the incidence rates, these are expressed as 1 million individuals at risk and are all age adjusted. So Wisconsin childhood cancer mortality rates have declined on average since 2000. And we're looking at this from a perspective of annual percentage change over time when we look at the trend. We did note that rates rose slightly in 2019 and 2020, but again, we're not statistically significant from the US rate. Next slide. Between 2016 and 2020, 158 Wisconsin children died of childhood cancers. And we have a breakdown here of males and females by age at death as well. You can see the totals are about equal for the combined age groups. So now we're looking at Wisconsin mortality rates split out by, sorry, skipped a slide. Wisconsin mortality rates for leukemias, brain, and other central nervous system tumors and lymphomas in Wisconsin. And those have all declined when we compare the previous decade from 2011 to 2020. The largest decrease in mortality rates was seen for lymphomas, and then followed by leukemias and brain and other central nervous system tumors. And these declines mirror US progress as well. We've got about 12% decline for all malignant cancers when we compare those two time periods. And so just overall conclusions, childhood cancer mortality rates are declining. We know that survival is improving. And then Wisconsin childhood cancer rates for many of the different stratifications and trends are similar to national rates. And so since that was a whirlwind, we just wanted to share, and I'll drop these two in the chat. We do have quite a few online public data platforms for folks who want to explore more of the Wisconsin Cancer Reporting System data. We make those available at our website, and then our email for data requests or other technical assistance if you can't find the data that you need is also always open. Those should be in the chat now. And then I think that's it from me. I'll pass it back to you, Alex.
Thank you so much, Lena. That was a fabulous presentation. And I forgot to mention it at the beginning, but we will be making this recording and the slides available after the presentation. So a follow-up email will go out with those. All right, with that, I am so thrilled to introduce Dr. Christian Capitini. So Dr. Christian Capitini is the Jean R. Finley Professor of Pediatric Hematology and Oncology and is presently Chief of the Division of Hematology, Oncology, and Bone Marrow Transplant at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He also serves as the co-leader of the Developmental Therapeutics Program at the UW Carbone Cancer Center. Dr. Capitini leads an NIH-supported laboratory focusing on development of cell-based therapies for the treatment of pediatric solid tumors and for complications of bone marrow transplant. In the clinic, Dr. Capitini is a sponsor and principal investigator for a clinical trial expanding gamma delta T cells in vivo using zoldronate after alpha beta T cell depleted stem cell transplant. He was also site PI for the first multi-center CAR T cell trial, which led to the FDA approval of Kymriah. Sorry, I Googled how to say that at the beginning, so I wouldn't mess it up. Presently, he is the site PI for multiple Kymriah trials for the upfront treatment of high-risk B-cell leukemia and for a long-term follow-up study. He is also a site PI for a multi-center GD2 CAR T cell trial for treating neuroblastoma and osteosarcoma through the Pediatric Cancer Immunotherapy Trials Network. And with that, I will let Dr. Capitini take it away.
Great. Thank you, Alex, for the introduction. Let's go to the next slide. These are my disclosures, of which none are overlapping with today. Next slide. So I have three objectives for today's presentation. One is to build off of Lena's outstanding review of epidemiology of childhood cancer in Wisconsin and just give a historical perspective. Second, I will review the background of advanced cell therapies, which include these cells called CAR T cells. And then at the end, I want to discuss the future outlook for immunotherapy for cancer here at UW. Next slide. So nationally, we see over 12,000 children diagnosed annually with cancer, which gives a risk of developing cancer before the age of 20 of about 1 in 300. About 2,300 children die from cancer every year, which makes it the second leading cause of death amongst children after firearms. Next slide. As was shown in Lena's presentation, the nationally is shown on the right. We predominantly see leukemia and lymphoma and brain tumors as the most common cancers that we treat. Interestingly, when you look at the patients that come specifically to American Family Children's Hospital, there's actually a slight predominance of brain tumors, and they're a bit higher than leukemia. But still, if you add the three diagnoses together, it still matches what we see nationally. Overall, we see between 80 and 100 new cancer diagnoses per year, making us a medium-sized program nationally. Next slide. Now, the good news. Yes, our survival rates have been outstanding. They are now approaching for all cancers 85%, and it's been increasing steadily over the last 50 plus years. 1 in 640 young adults is a childhood cancer survivor, which we now estimate to be close to 500,000 people in the US living as survivors. And so that will feed into the presentation later by my colleague, Dr. Kathy Lee Miller, about how we support these patients. Next slide. One of the common questions I get asked is, how were we so successful? And one of the most common cancers we treat, acute lymphoblastic leukemia, or ALL, is one of the prototypes in medicine on how working together we can advance survival rates. What this graph is showing you is over time, shown on the x-axis in years, that event-free survival has improved over the various decades. So in blue, you see in the 1950s when scientists had discovered chemotherapy and shown in a laboratory that when giving a single drug to cancer cells, they could be killed. When they gave those single drugs to children, they temporarily caused remissions, but a month or so later, the leukemia would always come back and everyone would die within a year of diagnosis. We then started to figure out that if you combine chemotherapy and give multiple drugs at the same time, it was harder for the leukemia to figure out a way to resist it. And survival started to improve. But in the end, you could see within 4 years, everyone died. And that's because leukemia can uniquely find a way to hide from chemotherapy. And a common place that it goes to hide is in the central nervous system, which is our brain and spinal cord. So in the 1970s, we started giving chemotherapy into the spinal fluid through spinal taps. And you can see now that in the orange, survival finally didn't approach zero, and patients were starting to survive. And through the 80s and 90s, we began to tweak therapy, giving more intense therapies if you had high-risk disease and less intense therapy if you had low-risk disease. And now we get to the survival of 85 to 90%. Next slide. I don't read very much, but one book that I would plug to the group is this outstanding book called The Emperor of All Maladies, which won the Pulitzer Prize just over a decade ago, written by Siddhartha Mukherjee. And it's a real biography of cancer, and it goes over how we got to our present treatments. But in particular, there's two things I want to highlight. One, it illustrates that really pediatric cancer, which all of you were generous to give time to attend today, provided the foundation for all of oncology to treat cancer, again, by showing how incremental advances can build on these developments, and showing how we can't treat things in different locations in different ways. We all have to work together. The other plug I'll put for the book is UW-Madison is mentioned 3 times in the book, and it's really nice to see how Carbone played a role in how we manage cancer in the United States. Next slide. So now the bad news. The bad news is, while we're doing a good job curing people, we, even for the survivors, have a lot of challenges to overcome. They have a 10-fold higher excess chance of dying of some other complication, either from their therapy or other diseases. 21% of these deaths are due to treatment-related consequences. And if you actually inquire with survivors, 2/3 of them have at least one long-term complication, and 1/4 of them have a severe or life-threatening long-term complication. So in a sense, we're curing people, but it's at a very high price, and sometimes the treatment can be as deadly as the disease. Next slide. So the goal of today's and all centers research in peds cancer is to develop treatments that have the high efficacy that we've been able to maintain with chemo, but to minimize toxicity. Next slide. And so one approach to do that I'm going to discuss today is immunotherapy, which is using the immune system to recognize and fight cancer. Now, UW has a really outstanding, and I'm very proud, history of really seminal discoveries within pediatric cancer and blood disorders, and that's highlighted on this slide. We helped contribute to the first successful unrelated bone marrow transplant, which occurred here in the mid-60s and at University of Minnesota, due to technology that was developed here by Fritz Bach, shown in this 50-year anniversary issue of the quarterly. Second, we went on to show that T cells play an important role in bone marrow transplant, and that T cells, which are normally designed to help fight viral infections, actually can also cause complications in bone marrow transplant, like graft versus host disease. But those same T cells are also responsible for killing leukemia cells, and that was a really important observation in the late 80s, early 90s. Later on in the 2000s, we went on to show that immunotherapy can improve other diseases, namely a solid tumor called neuroblastoma. And this treatment is an antibody treatment that, as shown on the bottom, improves standard of care for children with advanced neuroblastoma disease, and is now used part of upfront chemotherapy. And then more recently, CAR T cells have been FDA approved for pediatric leukemia, and that came about through multi-center and international clinical trials that I helped lead here. Next slide. We have a proud regional and national reputation, in part through support from both federal and non-federal organizations. As an example, shown on the right, we are part of a 10-member pediatric cancer dream team, which was supported from organizations like Stand Up to Cancer and the St. Baldrick's Foundation. And we now, for the last 10 years, have been working with children's hospitals across the United States and Canada to advance treatments in immunotherapy. As mentioned in my bio, we're part of the federal government's Cancer Immunotherapy Trials Network through the National Cancer Institute, have had support through the Beau Biden Moonshot. And then some unique things about American Family Children's Hospital include that we can offer radiopharmaceutical therapy like MIBG by having a lead-lined room present on our pediatric cancer floor. And in fact, if you look at all of the different cancers that are treated at Carbone, pediatric cancer has the most clinical trials open compared to everyone else. because this has become really our standard of care for treating children in Wisconsin. Next slide. Now, immunotherapy is a big bucket. Our immune system has a lot of different cells that live in it, and antibodies certainly are an important aspect of immunotherapy. What I want to talk about is cellular immunotherapy, taking cells out of patients' blood, growing them in the lab, genetically engineering them, and then giving them back to the patient. What this slide shows is how increasingly popular taking cells out of the body, engineering them, and giving them back to patients is becoming in the field of oncology. And in fact, if you can just click again, the arrow will point out that the #1 most studied therapy in the last 3 years has been CAR T cells. And the different colors that you see on the graph reflect the various stages of development, with yellow being preclinical work in laboratories, and then the magenta and the blue showing these therapies translating into patients with phase 1 and phase 2 trials. But more importantly, shown in the black and even in red, which is almost impossible to see, we're seeing phase 3 randomized studies and FDA approvals. Next slide. What is CAR T? CAR T takes advantage of properties of certain viruses, namely retroviruses and lentiviruses, who HIV is sort of the prototype. Their natural ability of viruses like HIV is to infect T cells. And in fact, that's how patients develop AIDS, because the virus goes into the T cell, it replicates inside the T cell, and the T cell explodes with other virus particles, and you lose your ability of your immune system to fight infections, and you develop AIDS. In this case, scientists have genetically engineered these viruses to not be able to replicate, but they can still infect. So it becomes an excellent delivery vehicle to deliver foreign DNA into T cells without any risk of getting sick. And one foreign DNA that you can deliver is this so-called CAR. Next slide. So CAR stands for chimeric antigen receptor, and chimeric means that it's a mixture. T cells don't normally express antibodies, but our body produces antibodies. So what the CAR looks like is shown in this picture. On the upper part of the slide is showing an antibody fragment that's able to bind a molecule that's present on B-cell cancers. On the lower part of the slide, shown in red and green, are basically genes that tell the antibody that when it engages its target, that T cell gets turned on and it's told to kill the target. Because antibodies by themselves normally just decorate cells and flag them, but they don't in and of themselves typically kill cells. So this is combining the properties of T cells to kill with the ability of antibodies, which are made by B cells, to label cells. Next slide. Practically, how this works is if a patient is eligible for CAR T therapy, in this case, a child with leukemia, we would collect their blood here at American Family Children's Hospital in an outpatient procedure called apheresis, shown at the top. That's a procedure that's between 2 and 4 hours long, and we can collect about 2 cups of blood. That blood is then frozen and shipped to a manufacturing facility, in this case in New Jersey, where the cells are thawed and exposed to a virus that infects the T cells and infects them with this CAR molecule. The cells are grown up to billions of cells over a period of a couple of weeks. They then undergo a week of quality control testing, are refrozen and shipped back to Madison or at any other center. And those cells are then kept in the freezer to the patients ready to be treated with CAR T. And this is using their own immune cells that are now genetically engineered to recognize and kill their cancer. So when they're injected into patients, they will grow inside the patient into trillions of cells and go out, hunt, and seek and destroy the cancer. Next slide. This really exciting and somewhat science fiction-like technology has actually led to FDA-approved drugs. And I'm proud to say that the first of these that was FDA-approved was a drug for pediatric leukemia, because so many times in history, drugs are approved in adults, and maybe if we're lucky, they get approved in children later on. But this was an example of where a drug got approved in children and later in adults. Click again, and you'll see that while we have 6 FDA-approved CAR T products, all of them treat blood cancers. But in fact, most people in the United States die of solid cancers, particularly metastatic solid cancers. So we have a long way to go in developing CAR T for solid tumors in children and adults. Next slide. Just some quick features about how potent these cells work. These are graphs, and you don't need to worry about the details of what the graph's showing, but it's basically showing over time that you can see a peak of various levels of cytokines in the blood. Cytokines are inflammatory markers, just showing that the body is heavily revved up when it gets this treatment because the immune system is killing cancer at an unprecedented rate. Next slide. Now, on the positive side, for patients who have failed multiple lines of chemotherapy, half of them had had a bone marrow transplant and failed that. We saw outstanding results in improvements in survival. Here showing at event-free survival at 6 months of 73% and overall survival of 90%. Typically, these patients would have been dead between 3 and 6 months, having failed bone marrow transplant. So to see that the very high majority of them still alive was a remarkable achievement. And that is why the drug was awarded things like breakthrough designation. And you can see at now longer-term data at 12 months, you have about a 50% chance of being cured with this therapy. Next slide. But it comes at a somewhat high price. In the first 4 weeks after getting the therapy, it causes some unique toxicities. Your body is not used to being able to handle having all of these cytokines elevated in the blood, and that's called cytokine release syndrome. And what this table is showing is that for some proportion of patients, they can develop life-threatening cytokine release syndrome, which is shown as the grade 3, grade 4. But fortunately, we have drugs that are able to manage that toxicity, but it means we cannot give this therapy at all hospitals in the United States. You have to be a certified specialized center to administer this therapy so that you have the right intensive care units to move patients if they get very sick. In addition, some patients on the third row develop a neurologic toxicity, which can range anywhere from confusion to somnolence to things like seizures or even life-threatening brain swelling. Next slide. Now, while it was FDA approved for children who kind of exhausted all options, I'm proud to say that as a country, the Children's Oncology Group, which is over 200 hospitals in North America, now is offering CAR T cells as upfront therapy, basically asking the question of, instead of treating B-cell leukemia with 2.5 years of chemotherapy and then getting people cured but with all of those side effects, can we take the highest risk patients who are most likely to not respond to chemotherapy, treat them instead of 2.5 years with 2.5 months of chemo, then give CAR T and then see if they're done. The idea here is that 50% of them have a chance of long-term cure. And if you can get them over that first 4 week of toxicity, they have pretty manageable side effects long-term without all the toxicity you get from all the years of chemotherapy. We're still accruing to this study and won't have results for several years. Next slide. But for those of you interested in solid cancers, there's a lot of interest in the field in using CAR T technology for solid cancer. And this is not meant to be an exhaustive list, but just showing the breadth of the kind of work that's going on right now for virtually every cancer you can think of. Next slide. And CAR T isn't the only way to make genetically engineered T cells. In fact, there are other products that are not genetically engineered that are working quite well. One called tumor infiltrating lymphocytes, or TILs, where we take biopsies of tumors like melanoma. There's a few T cells that are inside of the tumor, but we're able to grow them in the lab over a couple of months and get them the high enough numbers that if you infuse them back into patients, they can actually cause remissions of tumor. And I anticipate that that technology will be FDA approved by early next year. And then also on this slide are just showing other technologies that are a little earlier in development that also have potential to either treat cancer or side effects of cancer. Next slide. So I want to talk about neuroblastoma, which was that cancer that we had played a big role in developing a monoclonal antibody for. This is a cancer that's more rare than leukemia, but we see about 700 cases in the US, and half of those are high risk. And they get treated with the kitchen sink. If you can click again, things like chemotherapy, surgery, a stem cell transplant, radiation therapy. They get basically a year and a half of high intense therapy. Next slide. They happen to have on their cell surface a glycolipid, which is a sugar and a fat molecule that we were able to identify and target with an antibody. Next slide. And that molecule that we were able to target is not only on neuroblastoma, but just like the story I told you with CAR T for leukemia, now that molecule has been found on a variety of other cancers, not just in children highlighted in yellow, but on adults as well, like lung cancer and breast cancer. So again, showing that investing in research in children can pay it forward for research in adults. Next slide. What the antibody does is label the tumor cell for destruction by cells in our immune system, as shown on this slide. Next slide. And seminal work by my colleague, Dr. Paul Sondel, through the Children's Oncology Group, showed that this antibody improved survival for children with neuroblastoma, such that it is now FDA approved and standard of care. Next slide. But still, a third of patients are not cured. Next slide. So the other part is to say, why give an antibody and rely on the patient's own immune system to kill the cancer? How about combining those technologies, put the antibody into a T cell via a CAR, target the same exact molecule and see what happens? We were able to get that to work for leukemia. Can we get it to work for a solid tumor? Next slide. In fact, that's not my own unique idea. Others have already tried to do this. If you click again, these are a summary of about 10 recent clinical trials targeting GD2, often with the same exact antibody that the FDA-approved antibody uses, and the CAR T cells are not doing well. And my colleague, Dr. Becky Richards, in our division, has analyzed all of these studies and found that they're failing for 3 reasons. One, the CARs are not persisting in the body. They're just disappearing when they engage the tumor. Part of the reason of that is they get what's called exhausted. They kill, and then they're not able to form long-term memory, and they disappear. And then there may be evidence that the neuroblastoma figures out a way to get rid of GD2 on the surface, but that's less clear. Next slide. Now, there is hope that you can treat solid tumors, particularly targeting GD2. This work that Dr. Richards participated in when she was at Stanford showed that when treating brain tumors, which have even higher expression of GD2 than neuroblastoma, when you inject CAR T cells directly into the spinal fluid, the CAR T cells go right to the tumor, and as shown on the bottom here, can shrink tumors on an MRI scan, but more impressively on the bottom right, can improve neurologic exams. So children like shown in the picture who had nerve palsies where they can't smile symmetrically after the treatment are starting to smile. We have children who weren't able to color, who then are able to not just color, but stay in the lines and make beautiful pictures. Children who are paralyzed or paraplegic, regaining neurologic function, at least temporarily, but it's still, while improving their neurologic exam, not yet curative. But we know that we're getting closer to the answer. Next slide. So to conclude, I wanted to ask, in a research lab, how do we do the opposite of what Dr. Richards found in those prior trials? How do we maintain high activity, improve their persistence, and preserve memory? And how can we do this virus-free? Because while all of the CAR T products that have been FDA approved use viruses, we don't have a virus production facility, at least here in Madison. So we couldn't, even if we found something interesting, scale it up to give it in a clinical trial without contracting with some other company. Next slide. Now, there are non-viral methods to make CARs. They've been less effective than viruses to date, but some of those methods have included something called electroporation, shown on the right, where instead of providing a virus to deliver the CAR DNA, you electrocute the cell very minimally, And during that time, it basically creates a current that allows foreign DNA to enter the cell and get integrated. Next slide. There are many limitations to using viruses. So while they're very efficient at making things like CAR T cells, they inject the DNA randomly in the genome. And there's a concern from the FDA that the virus could put the CAR into a gene that protects us from getting cancer. So we have to monitor patients for 15 years, even if they're cured, to make sure they don't develop cancer from the CAR therapy. In addition, you always worry the virus, while it can't replicate, figures out a way to replicate. And so you have to monitor for that. The reason that we don't have viral production at clinical scale in Madison is it's very expensive. It's tens of millions of dollars to biomanufacturing costs to make liters and liters of clinical grade virus. And if you go to contract it out, it's a 2 to 3 year wait list to get your CAR made. Next slide. So recently, a year ago, actually, we published with colleagues at the Department of Biomedical Engineering an approach to make CAR T cells against GD2 using a technology called CRISPR-Cas9, completely virus-free. Next slide. The way CRISPR works, and this won the technology of CRISPR won the Nobel Prize just a few years ago. It's a great way that bacteria use to cut up DNA because the viruses that can infect them are made up of DNA and RNA. And so this enzyme has been co-opted by scientists as a way to edit DNA within human cells in a very directed fashion, such that you can put in foreign DNA when the DNA goes to repair itself. And in this case, the way we're asking T cells to repair themselves is to use the CAR as the repair. And that's shown in this picture. We can get T cells to express the CAR using this CRISPR technology. And we can introduce the CRISPR using electroporation instead of viruses. Next slide. Initially, when we did this work, we found that the tried and true viral CAR T cells, in some ways, were more potent. They made a lot more cytokine, which is shown in this picture in green. And so we thought viruses were better than using CRISPR. But in this picture, what I'm not showing you is that the CAR T cells haven't yet seen a tumor. So they're making all this cytokine showing they're activated. But since they haven't seen tumor, it means that they're burning out before they're even manufactured. They're kind of overstimulated. Next slide. And again. We analyzed our CRISPR cells using a genetic sequencing technology. And in this picture, you see purple and yellow cells. The purple cells, which are the predominant cell, are all memory phenotypes, whereas the yellow is shown as the exhausted cells. And so when you use virus-free approaches like CRISPR, you enrich for more memory cells, which would hopefully reverse the problem of what the other GD2 CAR T studies were showing. Next slide. And in fact, when we infuse these cells into mice, they work as well as retroviral cells, so they're non-inferior. Next slide. But the improvement is they're not exhausted. They stick around longer. And so while in our animal trials, we only gave 1 dose of the cells, our hope is that if they form memory over time, the animals will continue to do better, particularly if we treat them with serial doses to build up those numbers in the blood. Next slide. So one of our hopes and ways to conclude today's research update is I think that we have a platform now to not rely on companies to provide us with CAR T, where we have to collect cells here at UW, ship them out, and then get them back. But we have now the scientific expertise to do this and make homegrown products. And I think as we get increased laboratory and clinical research support, we'll be able to do that. Not just CAR T for solid tumors, but if you look on the right side, in an article that was just published in July from the group at Penn, CAR T is now being explored outside of cancer. It's being used as a treatment for autoimmune disease, treating cardiac disease, treating things like Alzheimer's, also treating infections. There's a lot of potential for this technology. And again, treating children with cancer provides the foundation for all of this to happen. Next slide. So in conclusion, I hope that you can take away that CAR T cells are genetically engineered to recognize and eliminate cancer at high potency, but with high regulatory oversight. And I hope that you understand that the impact is that for tumors that are not cured with surgery by itself, that they can be targets for immunotherapy like CAR T, and this will change the nature of oncology care. And that advanced cell therapy products, particularly if they're genetically modified, have the potential to generate personalized medicine for children with advanced cancer. And then the last slide. I just want to thank the folks in my lab who have worked on this and our close colleagues in biomedical engineering with Chris Saha and the students and scientists in his lab, our collaborator at St. Jude, Shengdar Sai, who helped us with the CRISPR CAR T, collaborators at Baylor College of Medicine and University of Georgia, and then lastly, Paul Sandel, Ken DeSantis, Melissa Scala, and Igor Slukvin, who are continuing with ongoing work in CAR T. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Capitini. I don't know if you plan to stick around till the end or if you'd prefer to take questions right now quickly. Do you have a preference?
My understanding is that I would stay at the end for questions.
Wonderful. Okay, just wanted to make sure.
Sure, thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm sure there will be plenty of questions for you at the end. But now
feel free to enter them in the chat too.
Yes, that would be wonderful. So that was a really great background on the current research and treatment and updates. But with that, we are now going to transition to the second part of this presentation, where we are going to focus more on the survivorship portion. So I think it's always helpful to start with the definition, because survivorship can mean different things to different people. And according to the National Cancer Institute, an individual is considered a cancer survivor from the time of diagnosis through the balance of their life. Survivors include those with the current diagnosis and those now free from cancer. Caregivers, often called co-survivors, family members, and friends are an important part of the cancer experience. Cancer survivorship refers to the health and life of a person with cancer post-treatment until the end of life. So this encompasses the unique needs that people have after they have a cancer diagnosis that need to be addressed, including the physical, mental, and social impacts of cancer. This includes pediatric and adolescent cancer survivors who often have unique needs and concerns that need to be considered over their lifetime. Another definition that is good to know is a survivorship care plan. According to the CDC, a survivorship care plan is a record of your cancer and treatment history, as well as any checkups or follow-up tests that you may need in the future. It may also list possible long-term side effects of your treatments and ideas for staying healthy. So now I am pleased to introduce our first panelist, Dr. Kathy Lee Miller. Dr. Lee Miller is an assistant professor of pediatrics in the Division of Pediatric Hematology Oncology. She has a clinical interest in patients with leukemias and lymphomas, as well as adolescents and young adults. She is currently the UW Carbone Cancer Center AYA Oncology Clinic, director of the UW Carbone Cancer Center AYA Oncology Clinic. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Lee Miller.
Thanks so much, Alex, for that kind introduction. I'm so humbled to follow the previous presentations as they really set the stage as we think about switching gears now to the survivorship stage. And so, like Alex mentioned, I'm the director of our Adolescent Young Adult Oncology Clinic here at University of Wisconsin in Madison. And so I'm just going to give you a background about AYA and how it's slightly different than pediatric cancer, slightly different than adult cancer, and it's kind of right in the middle. So just so we're all on the same page, the NCI definition of AYA, or adolescent young adult, is ages 15 to 39. So you can see that's a really wide age range, from kids who are still in high school all the way up to those who are in their late 30s. And the reason that age group has been separated out is because they face unique challenges when compared to either younger or older patients. We know that this age range is diagnosed with cancer, about 1 million cancer diagnoses per year worldwide, with a global population of 3 billion with a B AYAs. So, you know, 1 million out of 3 billion doesn't seem like a whole lot, but it is a high burden of disease. The estimates are around 87,000 patients in the AYA age range will be diagnosed with cancer in the United States each year. And you can see there on the numbers on the right there, how many of those are AYAs over the last, about 7 years ago, but those data still hold true. We know that cancer incidence amongst AYAs is increasing on average 0.3% faster than 0.3% per year, which is faster than in other age groups. And we know as of right now, there are about 2 million AYA cancer survivors in the US. And so it's a large population with a lot of unique needs. Next slide, please. So this graph is just trying to show you the increasing incidence of cancer, which I know was covered previously in the other presentation, but you can just see that when this is broken down between females and males, that there's increasing incidence of cancer in this age range. Now, there's some exclusions here, and I want to point that out. In females, they exclude thyroid cancer, and that is because it has been labeled as an overdiagnosis epidemic, meaning a lot of patients are being diagnosed with thyroid cancer for whom that diagnosis would never become clinically relevant. But with better screening techniques, we're seeing more and more diagnoses. So in order to not skew the numbers, we remove those from the female side. And then on the male side, those numbers were greatly skewed as HIV/AIDS came about because Kaposi sarcoma was much more prevalent when associated with HIV/AIDS. So we remove those as well, as again, to not skew the numbers. But you can see, even with removing those, the incidence of cancer is increasing in AYAs really since the 70s. Next slide. I show this just so you could get an idea of what types of cancers we're seeing in the AYA population. And you can see that it's different. So the youngest AYAs, we're still seeing lymphomas, germ cell tumors, leukemias, as was mentioned before, those are more common. And then those diagnoses become less common as you age up through the AYA age range, and that prevalence shifts and you can see more carcinomas. Next slide, please. The other thing that I think is really important, there's a lot of data in this slide, so I want to walk you through it. So this is now, we're looking at incidence of cancer cases and the annual percentage change. So these data are a little bit older, but they're from 1990 to 2010. So in that 20-year age period, what was the relative change in the percent of cancer cases in each of these 5-year age ranges? And what you can see is that the annual percentage change in survival was worst in the middle there. And so in the pediatric age range, the annual percentage change of survival was higher. And in the older age range, also higher. You can see that we're really helping more older adults. But during that time frame, though AYA relative survival, it did improve a little bit, and it didn't improve as much as for both younger and older patients. So based on these data, this was part of the reason why the AYA age group was considered a vulnerable population, because though we are seeing more survivors in this age range, they're not improving as much as either younger or older patients. And you can just see on the right there, I just threw in some of the relative survival of our patients, AYA patients, and you can see that it varies quite a bit based on race and ethnicity, as well as based on gender. Next slide, please. So why is that? So why are we not seeing the same improvements, or the not as quite as good improvements in survival for our AYAs? Well, there's a few reasons. We know that the AYA age range, there's a tendency to be underinsured, and so they may not seek medical care as quickly as those who are younger or are older. We know that there's a certain sense of age-related invulnerability that patients in the AYA age range may experience that's not felt at younger or older age ranges. We know that there are studies, particularly in leukemia, that show that patients with leukemia up to a certain age have better survival outcomes when treated on pediatric protocols and at pediatric hospitals. But there are age limitations at pediatric hospitals. You can't see a 35-year-old necessarily at a pediatric hospital. And so that may also be affecting the survival rates of these patients. We also just know that cancers diagnosed in the AYA age range probably have unique biologic traits. They may be more aggressive. They may have more chemo resistance, so they're more difficult to treat. We know that of all age ranges, AYAs have the lowest rates of clinical trial enrollment. And we also know that patients treated on clinical trials tend to have better outcomes. And then lack of psychosocial support. And there's always a question of adherence to therapies that may not be ideal in this age range. So it's multifactorial, like any difficult problem, but there's a lot of to unpack there and a lot that makes this population vulnerable. Next slide, please. So we know that AYAs, by definition, are diagnosed during a very complex psychosocial time. In this age range, most people are completing their formal education, moving out of one home into another, potentially starting a family, starting a career. So there's a lot that happens. There's a lot of normal development that happens, and often is derailed by a cancer diagnosis in this age range. And that then leads to psychological distress, understandably. So there are very high rates of psychological distress within the AYA oncology population, knowing that that affects not just their cancer care, but also their overall quality of life. Next slide, please. So to address these concerns, there have been more and more AYA oncology clinics that have been created around the country. We started ours here at UW-Madison in January of 2021. Now, we had a unique challenge in that we had been trying for several years to start an AYA oncology clinic, but one of our limitations was space. There was not space, physical space in the hospital to have dedicated space for AYA oncology. And so one of the sort of innovations that came about through the pandemic is, why not start a fully telemedicine-based clinic? It addresses the problem of space, it obviates the need for any physical space, and it also meets a lot of AYAs where they are, literally. And we know that AYAs tend to be technologically savvy. They tend to know how to, connect from their devices. And so we decided to try a telemedicine-based model. And so how our model works is that any patient between the ages of 15 and 39, whether they're currently battling cancer, whether they were just diagnosed, or whether they're in long-term survivorship, anyone currently in the ages of 15 to 39 can be referred to our AYA oncology practice. We'll then set up a 1 hour long one-time consultation with an oncologist, either myself or one of our adult oncology colleagues who has an interest in AYA. And that hour is spent discussing what resources they may find helpful to improve their quality of life. We do talk about their diagnosis, we talk about their treatment, but mostly we talk about how cancer and its treatment has affected their lives and how we can improve that in any way. Next slide, please. I kind of covered this already. Next slide, please. So after we meet with them one-on-one, then we meet with our interdisciplinary team 2 days later, and we discuss their case. And so by doing this clinic model, though they're only seeing one provider, they have access to a whole panel of providers who all have an interest in AYA care, physical therapy, occupational therapy. I have a list on the next slide, but this helps save time and money and makes us more efficient. So then I'll present the case, or whoever was the oncologist who saw the patient presents the case, we discuss the case and make sure there's no other resources that we think the patient may find useful. We then send copies of our notes to both the primary care physician and the primary oncologist. Next slide, please. So this is our multidisciplinary clinic, and it's a long list. And these are all folks who only have, rather than having to dedicate several hours of time to seeing patients, they'll 1 hour a week for a meeting where we discuss all the patients we've seen, and then they can review the chart and suggest if there's any other resources or referrals that may be relevant. Next slide, please. So that is just a brief introduction to what we do at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. I think AYA care is one of the frontiers as we think about how to improve quality of life and survivorship for patients with cancer. And so another thing that I didn't put in there, but I think is an important note to note, is that we also create survivorship care plans for these patients, because once they finish their formal oncology care, they need to transition to a provider who understands what their needs are now that they're a survivor of cancer. And so we put together survivorship care plans to discuss what the most common needs are and what screening these patients should get over and above what the average patient their age should get. And we distribute that to the PCP as well. So just as an effort to keep to keep these patients safe and to make sure that they're getting the follow-up they need. Thanks for inviting me to speak today, and I'd be happy to take questions later.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lee Miller. That was a really, really great presentation. We're going to move along now and I am happy to introduce Christina Nielsen. So Christina serves as the dedicated patient and community outreach manager at the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, playing a pivotal role in fostering connections and support within the local community. Her jurisdiction encompasses the expansive Upper Plains region, spanning across Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Wisconsin. By bridging the gap between patients, healthcare practitioners, and the wealth of resources provided by LLS, Christina orchestrates the dissemination of vital information about programs and services. Furthermore, she takes charge of coordinating a spectrum of impactful local initiatives, ranging from immersive educational events, both in person and virtual, to nurturing support groups. Christina's tireless efforts extend to facilitating ongoing assistance for patients by tapping into the wealth of national support resources available. Christina, feel free to dive in.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for having me. Again, wonderful presentation so far. I am just honored again, like someone had mentioned, to follow some of these wonderful presentations, and honored to be a part of this. So thank you again for inviting us. So again, my name is Christina Nielsen. I am the Patient and Community Outreach Manager for the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society. And my job is primarily to oversee our local services and help connect patients and providers to our national services as well. And so I like to think of my role as the friendly LLS traffic director. However you'd like to be connected, whatever you'd like to participate in, I'm happy to get you connected and happy to help bridge the gap. So within the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, our mission is to cure blood cancers. That is our end game. But until then, we are here to support patients along the way. And so our mission is three-armed. It's research, advocacy, and education and support. And my job primarily lives within that education and support realm, though I do work sometimes with our researchers and with our advocacy specialists. And we do have, actually, I believe, a couple of my colleagues here on the call from our advocacy team. So if you are interested in advocacy, want to get more involved, I'm happy to connect you. Next slide. So why are we focusing on pediatric blood cancers? Well, 40% of all cancers are blood cancers, of pediatric cancers. So that is why it's so important to our mission. We're here to cure all blood cancers, and 40% of childhood cancers are blood cancers. And 80% of childhood cancer survivors develop some kind of chronic health issues from treatment, some long-term and late effects. And so we know it's crucial to spend more time, more research, more advocacy time to find safer, more adjusted treatments for these children. Only 5% of oncology drugs have been approved for first use in children and teens. And so what that means is that kids in pediatrics are getting treatments that were developed first for adults. And so that's why there are so many long-term late effects that we're seeing. So next slide here. LLS is focusing on this problem. We're launching this project called Dare to Dream. And it is, we have 4 different sections of our project that we can tell you more about. One is our LLS PEDAL Master Clinical Trial. And this really is our first global master clinical trial for acute leukemias. And we have a therapeutic side and also a screening trial. So we are partnering with Children's Oncology Group, NCI, and also it's I always forget what the abbreviation stands for, European Pediatric Acute Leukemia Foundation. So again, it's a global clinical trial. We already have 171 sites that are currently enrolled, and we've started to enroll patients. And so really exciting work there. We're also doubling down on our policy and advocacy initiatives. Our hope is to, try to advocate for accepting new pediatric treatments, helping to develop those cancer treatments that are for use in children first and not adults. Promoting access to care for young survivors. We know that survivors going into adulthood have all these long-term and late effects that they're adjusting to and might face insurance discrimination. That might be considered a pre-existing condition. So we're really hoping to double down on our advocacy initiatives. So again, if you'd like to participate in advocacy, go to lls.org/advocacy. And after my presentation here, I'll pop some links into the chat. And then, of course, we're here to invest in research. We have another slide here on research, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time right there. And then finally, my wheelhouse, which is the patient education and support. We're here to provide more support for patients along the way until we can ultimately find the cure. So next slide, please. So again, we're advancing groundbreaking research. We're trying to increase our fundraising initiatives so that we can ultimately hit a goal of $52 million by 2027. So 11 million in 2018 to 30 million in 2022. And our lofty goal again is 52 million. So currently we're funding 32 pediatric specific grants, including long-term treatment side effects and improving detection of relapse. So we're really focusing on research, trying to get ahead of things a little bit. So next slide, please. Again, we have the LS PEDAL Master Clinical Trial. So it's a master clinical trial in partnership with Children's Oncology Group, NCI, and our European Foundation. And we've already achieved so much. So one of the great things that we've been able to do is partner with UW Chicago to create the first pediatric data commons. So historically, researchers haven't really shared a lot of their findings with each other. You know, research can get a little bit competitive. And so by being sort of the third party to facilitate this, this data commons, we've partnered with UW Chicago to launch this ability for all of our researchers to share information about genetics and about what treatments are working for what patients, so that we can use this tool called Gearbox to find a treatment that best suits this pediatric patient's unique tumor biology. So it's a really exciting thing that we've launched. Again, I'll pop some links into the chat if you want to learn more. Next slide, please. So again, we're doubling down on our education and support. And so here are some of the wonderful things that our organization has launched over the past year or two. Some of the things I'm going to call out there, we have a new, a new children's book series. It's a 3-part children's book series called The Stars Will Twinkle and the Sun Will Shine. And it highlights the story of Olivia, who was diagnosed with a blood cancer. The first book highlights her diagnosis. The second book talks about her treatment. And the third book talks about, getting back to her life after treatment. So that is available to order by calling our Information Resource Center. And I'll give you that phone number here in a couple slides. We also have a we call a Medi-Teddy, which hides an infusion bag for patients that are inpatient. There is a wall calendar there on the screen that helps to organize medications, appointments, all kinds of wonderful stuff, and endless other resources. Oh, the last one I want to mention, we have a nutrition handbook for parents, which has really wonderful recipe cards you can actually rip out of the back. But it also has in the back this food, fun, nutrition to learn, grow, and play. And it has our friend Olivia from the book series, and it has sort of a children's guide to nutrition with recipe cards for kids so they can make their own healthy snacks. So it's a really cute thing. Again, all these are completely free to order. You can call our Information Resource Center, and some of these you can order on our website as well. But again, completely free. Shipping is completely free. So if you'd like to find out more information about those, please let me know. I'm happy to help. Next slide, please. So community-based education and support. So again, part of my work is to offer community-based education. And so we have, I realize now that National Cancer Conference has already passed, but we have an upcoming one here in St. Paul, the Upper Midwest Blood Cancer Conference in November. And we have some pediatric specific education opportunities coming in the spring. So if you'd like to be more involved with those, find out more about those opportunities, please let us know. Next slide, please. So our Information Resource Center, I talked a little bit about these guys. If you'd like to order some of our education materials, or if you just have questions, these are our team of master's level clinical oncology specialists who have been in the field for many years, usually social workers, health educators, nurses, people that are here to help answer questions or provide support. Again, they can facilitate the ordering of any of our publications, but they can also give you questions to ask your doctor, how to get a second opinion. In general, provide outside resource referrals for other helpful organizations that we might not provide support for. So a really wonderful team here, and I'll have you play the video because the video really says it better than I can. Oh, there is sound to it. It is just a jazzy little tune, but so you don't need the sound, but there is sound.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm trying to figure it out. I don't know if I can get the sound to work.
That's okay. Like I mentioned, you don't need it. It's just a little background music. So instead, you just have to watch. Oh, thank you for putting the video in the chat. So really, it's just a wonderful video that kind of talks about the unique ways that our Information Resource Center can help. It's really a personalized approach to helping a blood cancer patient. I like to think of it as sort of the extension of their healthcare team. Sometimes I call it the social worker's best friend, because sometimes if you have a person with a lot of questions, or maybe they have a question and it's 8 p.m. at night, our Information Resource Center is open 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. Eastern time. So they can reach our information specialists about really any kind of questions they might have. Next slide, please. So another service that we offer that's a personalized service is our Clinical Trial Support Center. So these are our team of clinical trial nurse navigators who have specialty in the field of clinical trials, who have now come to LLS to offer their services to help patients on their clinical trial journey. Now, sometimes they are there to just educate patients, providers, healthcare providers, family members about what is the clinical trial process, what is the clinical trial, and what am I really signing up for? And so sometimes they're really just educating about the process and helping to debunk myths. For instance, you won't get a placebo on a cancer clinical trial. That's not ethical. So they'll kind of walk patients and providers and family members through that process. They'll actually do a complete interview with the patient and get their entire background to find an appropriate list of clinical trials for that patient to bring back to their medical provider and talk through all of the scenarios. If they choose to enroll in a clinical trial, they'll facilitate that enrollment process, help to navigate barriers to access along the way. So perhaps travel is a barrier or lodging is a barrier. They're going to help to find financial assistance or other resources to help facilitate that process. And they'll do follow-up along the way, checking in on the patient, checking to see how the clinical trial went after it's been completed, and facilitating the enrollment in a new clinical trial if they choose to do that at that point. So really, it's a wonderful service. It's completely free. Anybody that's interested simply can call our Information Resource Center for more information. And again, it's a personalized approach. So talk to a nurse navigator today to find out what clinical trials might be open today. You can pick up that search again a year from now if it sounds like maybe treatment isn't panning out. And it's the same clinical trial nurse navigator working with you from a year ago. So it's a really great service. Next slide. Again, we have a tremendous amount of support resources. This is not an exhaustive list. We have so much more on ls.org, but a few of the things I want to point out, we do have patient webcasts. If you go to ls.org/webcasts, these are held live, usually a couple of different times each month on a variety of topics. And if you're not available to attend while they're being held live, you can watch the recordings, you can download the slides, you can download the transcripts. So no matter your learning styles, you can really participate in that education. We have patient podcasts and a provider podcast. So we have a patient podcast called The Bloodline with LLS, and we also have a provider podcast called Treating Blood Cancer. So if you like to learn on a little bit of a higher level, you're welcome to listen or subscribe. And again, you can find those anywhere you find a podcast. We also have the LS community, which is essentially our social media style platform. And that's a great way to connect as well. We have personalized nutrition consultations. And so if you have nutrition questions or you would like more support, absolutely, those are completely free and over the phone with our registered dietitian. And then we also have what's called the Patty Robinson Kaufman First Connection Program. This is a program where we can connect you with a patient, a caregiver, somebody who has been through the diagnosis that you're currently experiencing. We can connect you based on diagnosis, based on treatment, based on walk of life. So if you're a single mom and would like to talk to another single mom, we can make that happen. We have a national database of volunteers that can help support any patient that's interested. And then finally, we have our Health Manager app. So anywhere that you find an app, you can look for the LLS Health Manager. And it's a great way to track your medications, your side effects, your hydration, your meals, so you can really stay on top of your cancer journey. Next slide. And financial support. So there's a lot of information on this screen, so I'm not going to go into detail here because I can get in the weeds a little bit when I talk about financial support, but just know that there is support available. The programs do open and close based on whether or not we have funding. And so they might not be open now, but they could be open tomorrow. There's really no predictable schedule on when those funds open and close. It's just when we have enough funds to open them, they will open. Again, you can call that phone number or you can visit our website. You can apply over the phone online, and the programs range in terms of their purpose and the dollar amount. So some of them have a specific purpose. Some of them really aren't meant to be for anything in particular. But you can, again, call the phone number here on the screen or go on our website and apply online as well. Next slide. We also have a scholarship. So this is new. We just launched this last year. We've only had now 2 rounds of recipients, and applications are due October 31st. So if you know who is a young adult diagnosed with a blood cancer, they don't have to be a young adult now, but they had to have been diagnosed at 25 or younger, they can qualify for the scholarship. It's up to $7,500, and it can go towards an institution that's in person or online. So it really any kind of higher education opportunities. And there's a few different things you have to do to submit an application, but absolutely, if you know anybody, applications are due October 31st. Next slide. Oh, and that is it. So again, my name is Christina Nielsen. If you have any questions about our services, I'm happy to connect you. If you'd like any of these tangible resources I talked about, I'm happy to help facilitate placing an order. And again, thank you so much for inviting us.
Thank you so much, Christina. That was a fabulous presentation with a lot of really great resources shared. Now I'm going to move along quickly to Julie so that we can still have some time left over at the end for questions. And I am so thrilled to introduce Julie Nichols. Julie Nichols is a nurse clinician working in childhood cancer survivorship at Children's Wisconsin, their Next Step survivorship program as a nurse educator and coordinator and member of the Children's Wisconsin fertility team. Julie is active in the survivorship community and is on the planning committee for a local survivorship conference held in Milwaukee every other year. She has completed the ECHO training, enriching communication skills for health professionals in oncofertility, and has 11 years experience in pediatric hematology oncology. She is a member on the Pediatric Initiative Network through the OncoFertility Consortium. She has helped develop and coordinate the novel Bridge to Transition program that helps patients and families as they transition from active treatment into post-therapy care. And with that, I will let Julie begin her presentation.
Hello, and thank you for inviting me to talk about the Next Step Survivor program at Children's Wisconsin. I'm excited to share our program with you all, especially during Pediatric Cancer Survivor Month. My role is to provide education and facilitate coordination of care for survivors of all ages with a history of pediatric cancer and bone marrow transplant. Our clinic strives to improve and standardize transitions of care from diagnosis to survivorship to community care, specifically focused on transitioning care to primary care, similar to Dr. Lee Miller's discussion. Today, I'm going to discuss our program process and tools we utilize to enhance and advocate for our patients' quality of life. The Next Step Survivor Clinic has a transition program bridging patients from active treatment to off-therapy treatment. Our services are open to any patient of any age with a history of pediatric cancer or bone marrow transplant, also known as BMT. We offer a variety of resources. A few examples of some of the resources our team provides for patients. Besides screening and healthy living, our adolescent and young adult AYA support, supporting learning plans such as IEP or 504 plans, specialty care follow-up, primary care and dental establishment, scholarship information, like Christina mentioned, and psychosocial support. Next slide, please. The Next Step members, who I'm so honored to work with and thankful for, consist of a multidisciplinary team with 2 nurse practitioners, 1 BMT, 1 oncology, 2 physicians, 1 RN, myself as the nurse educator, 1 fertility navigator, 3 psychologists, 1 dietitian, 3 school teachers from the Wauwatosa School District, 2 social workers, 1 survivorship community navigator, and a research team for ongoing non-therapeutic research studies. We also have access to physical therapy, dermatology, and cardiology team members as needed. We know through patient and family outcomes that transitioning off of treatment can be anxiety-provoking to patients and families. Hence, our transition program easing patients into follow-up care. This is an example view of a letter we provide to patients and families explaining how the survivorship team will transition them through 3 different visits as they near end of treatment. The transition consists of 1 visit 1 to 2 months before end of treatment with a survivorship provider, 1 visit a few months after treatment with a survivorship provider and a psychologist, then a full transition to the survivorship team at 2 to 3 years post end of therapy to meet our whole multidisciplinary team. We are in the same clinic and work with their primary team all the way through. From this point, the patient and family follow in the Next Steps clinic for the duration of their time at Children's Wisconsin, which is usually 10 years post end of therapy or through high school. Bone marrow transplant patients tend to stay with our team longer as there are often more chronic late effects and no known adult BMT survivor clinics to transition care to. The treatment summary is a tool used in our clinic. It is a detailed summary of a patient's diagnosis through end of treatment, our version of a survivorship care plan. It is a template from COG, Children's Oncology Group, revised into our own, and it lives in EPIC, which is Children's Electronic Health Record. I know COG was mentioned earlier in the presentation, and I just want to note that Children's Oncology Group is funded by the National Cancer Institute, who supports clinical trials and the world's largest organization devoted to childhood and adolescent cancer research. And Children's Wisconsin is a COG participant. The treatment summary content, and I'll show you an example of the treatment summary on the next slide, includes patient demographics, treatment center and treating provider contact information, treatment modality details, so whether that's chemotherapy, radiation, surgery, bone marrow transplant, CAR T-cell therapy, potential late effects and screening, fertility preservation, complications during treatment, current late effects, other clinical issues, and a specific follow-up plan. This treatment summary is shared electronically with the primary care physician initially when the patient gets to the survivor clinic, and then annually with them to enhance communication and collaborative care. The same information is also shared with the patient via MyChart or a mailed letter format. This is a glimpse of the 3-page treatment summary template that's created when a patient transitions into the Next Steps clinic. This information is also shared with community providers that care for the patient, as I mentioned. We are learning that community providers that provide care for our patient population find it helpful to have a quick view of what they need to know as far as responsibility of the oncology or BMT provider versus the primary care provider, understanding that the patient will also maintain an advocate for themselves as well. So not shown here as our team is still in process of implementing, but our team developed a summary of this form, this 3-page form condensed into 1 page as a quick reference of a patient's plan of care. The Passport is another novel tool used in our program. Each survivor patient that is seen in the Next Steps clinic receives one. It's a wallet-sized, double-sided, individualized card. It includes the patient's abbreviated treatment summary on one side and screening recommendations on the other side, according to the COG guidelines. It's printed in our office through a card printer, which gives us the ability to update or reprint at any time. This is the Passport example, blown up but looking tiny, but it's similar in size in real life to an ID or a credit card. So it's not an emergency card, but we counsel patients to keep a card with them in their wallet or purse or take a picture of both sides in order to use as a tool to advocate and communicate their health history and screening recommendations. This card is especially important for a patient to utilize with a new primary care provider, specialty provider, a sick visit on a college campus, for example, relocating due to personal choice or insurance reasons, traveling, and so on. Our patients are used to the idea of this card when they reach survivorship because we also utilize the card function for investigational drug information like blinatumomab, fever, sepsis instructions for emergency visits, asplenic patients, and more. On the left side of the screen is one side of the card. This side has the recommended follow-up screening details, patient demographics, and provider contact information. The potential late effects in screening monitoring is categorized in a chart form by what body system, exam, or lab, or image, what time frame, or how often a recommendation is to be screened. This is individualized and based off of what treatment modality a patient received, dosages, age, and other diagnostic factors. So for example, probably hard to see here, but if a patient had a type of chemotherapy in the anthracycline class or chest radiation, we know that cardiac function is to be monitored through echocardiogram, intervals every 2 or 5 years, or a fasting lipid panel. Another example is if a patient had chemotherapy, methotrexate, or steroid exposure, bone health screening recommendations are discussed. To the right of the screen, the other side of the card, is the abbreviated treatment history that includes the patient's diagnosis, date of diagnosis, end of therapy date, followed by chemotherapy, bone marrow transplant, surgery, radiation, or other. And the card also references the COG guidelines link, which we refer families to refer to as they wish. Our team refers to the COG guidelines, as I mentioned, for screening recommendations as a standard resource for clinicians who provide ongoing healthcare to survivors of pediatric malignancies. These resources help enhance recommendations for screening and management of late effects that may potentially arise as a result of the treatment a patient received. So this is an example of a health link titled Introduction to Long-Term Follow-Up After Cancer Treatment. These health links help provide context in order to understand the passport and screenings recommended. COG developed a series of these health links, providing more in-depth written information about topics such as the identified late effects of the body, healthy living, and maintaining healthcare. And COG updates their guidelines about every 5 years. And as I mentioned, these health links are accessible to anyone through their website, which I'll share at the end, and I think we shared in the chat. So that was the Next Steps program in a nutshell. I have written my email. If anyone has questions or want to connect, please feel free to reach out. One of our priorities in our program is enhancing relationships with community providers across Wisconsin and identifying providers that are comfortable taking care of the pediatric cancer survivor population. Also listed is the Children's Oncology Group Guidelines link, where you can find the health links discussed and more. Our Next Step Survivor Program link, where you can find all of the content I discussed today and more. We will share these in the chat box as well. And then we support a triathlon for our survivors at Hoyt Park in Tosa every summer in collaboration with our sports medicine team here at Children's. So that is my plug for supporters and community volunteers. We also hold a biennial survivorship symposium every other year for primary care providers, patients, advocates, and beyond. And that is my plug for the save the date, which is November 2024. So again, please email me if you're interested in connecting or attending. And thank you again.
Thank you so much, Julie. That was a wonderful presentation. And I know we are at time, but if you are able to stick around, we do have just maybe like a minute or so for questions to our presenters. Beth, if you are still on, did you want to pull any from the chat that have been dropped throughout?
Yeah, of course. I think we had one earlier regarding research, that there's an effort underway in the legislature to ban gain of function research in the state. And if anybody knows, would that have any impact on research advances?
It's a good question. I mean, generally, gain of function research has revolved around putting attributes into viruses and other pathogens that can make them more deadly, to try and understand and develop treatments in case that were to happen. So generally, the viruses that we're using are the opposite. They're loss of function. So I don't think it'll impact us, but it's something always to closely monitor, because sometimes language can be written ambiguously and can unintentionally impede research. So something definitely to keep an eye on, but I don't see any direct impact on research.
Great, thank you. I know we have a number of policy individuals on the call today, so hopefully they can make a note and help monitor that for us. We had a question that came in. Will a complete data brief be released at any point in the near future? And I can respond with that one and say yes. So we are in the final steps of just getting it approved. And our hope is by the end of the month, we will be able to publish in partnership with Lena and the Wisconsin Cancer Reporting System, a data brief on pediatric cancers. Other questions? Alex, I don't see any others coming through.
Great. Well, just to wrap it up quick, thank you again to our presenters. We're so appreciative of your time today, sharing your knowledge with our members. I'm going to just give one more little plug. If you joined us today and you are not a member, we would absolutely love to have you join us. You can do so by just scanning this QR code here, or you can go to our website to find more. You can read some of the benefits there to the left. One more plug for our Cancer Summit that is coming up in November. This is free to attend. It's happening November 1st and 2nd at the Wilderness Resort in the Wisconsin Dells. This year's theme is the power of action. So you will be hearing from members of communities across Wisconsin talking about how they are using their stories to put plans into action to address health outcomes in their communities. And we would love to have you join us. You can find the registration info on our website, and this will also go out in the email that will come out after this webinar. We also have a survivorship mini grant opportunity happening right now. The deadline is quickly approaching on the 21st. So we are offering up to $1,000 for organizations who are addressing activities that offer psychosocial support to cancer survivors for things such as support groups. So we would love to have you apply if that is something that you think you would work on. And then lastly, just one more plug for the Cancer Experience Registry survey from the cancer support community. And so this is looking to uncover the emotional, physical, practical, and financial impact of cancer to help patients and caregivers get the support they need. So anybody who has had a cancer diagnosis or been a cancer caregiver at any time and is currently 18 is eligible to participate. So we are actively promoting this survey and have surveys available if you are interested in also helping us promote and share this. And so thank you all again today for attending. A follow-up webinar will be coming, or a follow-up email will be coming out in a few days with the links, the slides, the recording. So stay tuned for that. Thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you soon.